Welcome to a new episode of Superpowered Fancast. I'm Darren. On this episode of the Fancast, I have the pleasure of speaking with writer Lilah Sturges. Lilah is an amazing comic book and fantasy writer who came to my attention co-writing the Eisner Award-nominated Fable spin-off series, Jack of Fables, with Bill Willingham, as well as graphic novels set in the world of Lumberjanes. Her latest graphic novel is The Science of Ghosts from Legendary Comics. The story is about a transgender parapsychologist named Joy who is dealing with challenges both past and present, including her first relationship post-transition, a hostile ex-wife, and a long-forgotten murder. So without further ado, check out my interview with Lilah Sturges and let me know what you think. Welcome to a new episode of the Superpowered Fancast. This is Darren. My guest on the podcast is Lilah Sturges, a great comic book artist. I'm a comic book writer. I'm a fan of. I'm sorry, I get a little fanboy flustered sometimes, especially talking with writers. So just getting that out of the way. If I ask you any questions you've answered millions of times, I apologize in advance. But um, but I really appreciate you being on. And I really want to talk about Girl Haven, but I also want to talk about your other work as well. Now, usually the first question I always ask, and it's kind of a broad question, but I always like to understand someone's journey to comics. I've been a comic book fan since I was 6 years old. So
hmm
so I kind of always want to ask, and I've read a lot of your work. So my first question I would ask is, what was your journey to the comic book world and ultimately to the industry itself?
it's a funny story. I did not read comics growing up, and I was not interested in them. So I was much more interested in music, and I wanted to be a rock star as a young person.
Gotcha.
I was in a number of bands starting in high school, and I moved to California for a while to try and make it as a musician. Didn't pan out, obviously. And so when I moved back to Texas in 1998, I decided to get serious about writing, but I wanted to write prose novels. And at that point, I had started reading comics. I started reading them in college around the time when the sort of like British invasion was happening, with Neil Gaiman and Sandman and Grant Morrison and all those guys, and really loved that stuff. And so I thought, okay, well, comics can be cool, but it never occurred to me that I could write them, like that would be a job that someone could do. And then I met Bill Willingham in 1998. We were in a writing group together, and that's how I got to know him. And when after Fables took off, he was looking for someone to be a co-writer for Jack of Fables, and he asked me to do it. And I was like, okay, well, I guess I could try writing a comic. That could be fun. And here I am, almost 20 years later.
Well, that's great. In fact, that's where Jack of Fables was where I was where I was introduced to your work because I had
hmm
started reading Fables years ago because it was such an interesting concept, and then I started reading like all of the different spin-off comics and collecting them as well, and even even started playing the game Wolf Among Us, and
hmm
so I just so it definitely put your name on the radar for me as far as writing goes. But was it something where when you were writing those comics after working with Bill Willingham that you decided you wanted to write your own stories, or was it like, hey, I want to continue writing other characters that I've enjoyed, and then eventually it transitioned into this wanting to tell your own stories themselves.
Yeah, I think in the past I didn't really think about it too hard. I wanted to write, And so I would kind of take whatever jobs they would throw at me, and I would try to do, the best that I could. It was, working for DC, it was very much like, you know, here are the jobs, do you
Mhm.
want to write this book or not, And if you do, then like pitch me something for it. So, that's how I got on Blue Beetle. That's how I did, all the superhero stuff that I did for DC. I did pitch House of Mystery. Bill Willingham helped me with that pitch and wrote some of the first issue. And then I did that, for 42 issues. Um, and so I had a lot of fun doing that, mostly, doing the DC Vertigo stuff and the superhero stuff. And then around like 2012, around there, that stuff started to peter out and my work started to dry up. And I wasn't actually doing much comic book writing at that time. And then I had other stuff going on because being transgender, I was going through a lot in my personal life. And then when I decided to transition, that sort of opened up a lot of stuff for me. And so it also sort of like gave me a chance to have a second comic book career where I could sort of, as myself, start telling stories that were more personal to me, um, that were more the kind of stories that I really wanted to tell, but didn't entirely feel comfortable telling before, that kind
Mhm.
of thing. So I really feel like I've had two careers in comics, which is pretty great. Like most people don't get that.
Well, then along those lines, I mean, just from the constraints of um the stories you wanted to tell in established books versus wanting to tell the stories you wanted to later on. Did you ever find a way to kind of incorporate some of the emotions that you were feeling at the times into the books you were writing? And I mean, I know you couldn't just come out and say, this is how I'm feeling, this is this is who I am, this is what
Sure.
I'm going to do. But were you able to, just for your own sanity, find like a way to kind of introduce some of those elements into your work?
I
The
really
work
did. House of Mystery was a big um, part of that for me. That was a very personal book, even though it's, this sort of crazy, fantasy horror thing,
Mhm.
this sort of like in the Sandman universe and
Right,
all
right.
that stuff. But I found lots of ways to sort of like slip in my own personal feelings about things. That's sort of a story about being trapped. And that was how I felt a lot of the time, was trapped, sort of inside my own skin. And so that translated a lot into, how the characters in the story were feeling and stuff like that. That was the primary one, I think, was House of Mystery, where I put a lot of myself into it.
Yeah. And I would agree with you. Like any especially anything from the Sandman universe, to me has always felt like it has that kind of freedom to be able to tell different kinds of stories from different perspectives. Like
Hmm.
I think because like this again from a comics perspective, like the character of Desire was one of those characters where I was like, okay, this is something completely different and it makes perfect sense in this universe and frankly in the universe itself. And so yeah, it just always kind of made sense to me. So and yeah, as a reader, like I'm an avid reader of Sandman and those works, and I've read House of Mystery, and I can definitely see where that is. And I'm not, I can't break down specifics because it's not necessarily my
Sure.
perspective. But at the same time, there's a part of me that's glad you got to in that work, especially in the freedom of that universe, to kind of put those things out there, if only for your own sake. But when you decided to start doing your own work, was it something where it's like, hey, I want to where you wanted to just kind of purge the things that you were going through personally into the work itself? Or was it like a level of catharsis where you were writing, it was like, okay, well, this is kind of how I would want the world to work if it could in the way that I needed to.
Um, are you talking about like before I transitioned or like after?
I think after, like maybe after.
After, yeah, I mean, I think, one of the first things I did after I transitioned was Lumberjanes. And getting to write that book was really wonderful because Lumberjanes takes place in this world where there's no homophobia, there's no sexism, there's no transphobia, nothing like that. Everybody just, is cool and likes each other and is respectful of other people.
Right.
And that was really a beautiful experience to kind of live in that world where it's this hopeful kind of fiction. It's like this proposing the kind of world that we would like to live in. And that is very freeing in a lot of ways. And then, you have a book like Girl Haven that is extremely personal. And while it's a fantasy book, it's bringing in um, a lot of confusion and fear and uh, about real world issues, you know? So it was, I've had a lot of opportunities to sort of like express different things in different ways. And it's been, an incredibly valuable experience for me. And I think it helps other people too, sort of meeting them where they are.
Right.
And a book like Girl Haven, which is sort of a coming of age story about a young trans girl. Um, I've gotten messages from adult trans women. This is a book for kids. I've gotten messages from adult trans women saying, "Hey, this is you told my story. This meant so much to me. This, I was in tears reading it, and that is a really powerful experience to have, just to know that like something that you put out in the world really resonates with someone else.
Hmm.
And, that's huge. And then, to be able to go on to do a book like The Science of Ghosts,
Right.
which is the new book, um, and sort of like do something even different again with these ideas and feelings. It's like, it's really powerful.
Yeah, I was going to ask how that worked as far as informing the science of ghosts. What I mean, because one of the things I always want to know about as well is also kind of the process. I love to know the the idea, and I never want to be spoiled, like
Mhm.
spoiled about the things I want to discover it on my own. But I always love to kind of understand the process. So when you were developing the science of ghosts,
Mhm.
was it like what was that process like? What did you kind of want, um not necessarily the story to be, but what kind of things did you want as the writer to be able to put into the story, as far as just kind of from either like the mystery of the characters or the world,
Sure.
things like that.
Sure. It's sort of, for me, I don't know how it works for other people, but for me, it's always like there's these sort of ideas floating around, and I kind of pull them down and smush them together and see what sticks and what will become a story, right?
Mhm.
That's worth telling. And, I always have loved ghost stories and I've always loved murder mysteries. And I wanted to do something that had that in it. But as far as like what was important to me about telling the story was for a long time, I've been trying to find a story that had a transgender person as a protagonist, but that wasn't about their trans journey or whatever. It wasn't about them being trans. It's just like the person happened to be trans, and then we tell a story about them.
Right.
Because that's something you don't really see ever, is trans
Mhm.
people just doing stuff,
Yeah.
and like, oh yeah, they happen to be trans too. So that's a thing, and that's part of who they are. Um, and maybe that informs the story in some ways, but it's not what the story is about.
Right.
And so that was kind of my like the thing I was planting a flag with was this notion of like, I want to have a story with a trans protagonist that is not about being trans.
Right. And even just from reading the synopsis, like it especially the things that it touches on as far as like, the relationship, ex drama with the ex-wife. Those are
Mhm.
all like those are universal kind of constructs for everyone. So
Yeah,
I can understand what you were saying, what you're saying as far as, it's not a specifically trans experience. It's a life experience. It's what happens with people, whatever change they make in their lives. So that which is one of the things that kind of interests me about the story itself. Um, but as far as like the story, like you were talking about, wanting to tell a ghost story. Is that something that, I mean, especially from going from like fantasy and huge fantasy like Sandman and fantasy like
mhm.
Fables, was it were ghost stories a easy kind of transition for the story, or was this something that you had to either research or really kind of think about as far as the the parapsychological world you wanted to explore?
Sure. Well, it's funny because coming from, those books that I loved, like Sandman and stuff like that, they're very like big idea, big fantasy
Right.
things, It's like death is a person. Like that's a big
Yeah.
concept, right?
Mhm.
And so but the kind of stories that I really prefer to tell are stories that feel very real. And so I wanted to bring it very close down. And the reason it's called the science of ghosts is because, the character is a scientist. She's a forensic psychologist who studies ghost behavior, and it's told in this very sort of like almost dry manner, the way that she interacts with ghosts. It's very businesslike. It's very, and I wanted it to have that feeling of like reality to it, because my favorite stories are the ones that bring you into a reality and make you feel like that's where you are.
Right.
And for me, it's more fun to do that with things like it's a world that's so close to ours, except for this one little detail, which is that
Mhm.
there are ghosts.
Right. Which is probably one of the things I love about one about comics themselves, but about just stories in general, is that the best of them, they have the ability to tell the story of a world that we all know, but with something additional added that's kind of add some additional flavor to it. And even
Right.
especially with the protagonist, just adding a different perspective is interesting to me. But and on that note, is this like how did the because I know it's I can kind of guess, but I mean I may be wrong, but like recently Legendary is kind of getting into the comic book realm. Is it something where you pitched Science of Ghosts to them, or is it something where they came to you and said, hey, do you have any ideas for a comic that we could publish?
Yeah, it was like in 2018, I had a meeting with the folks at Legendary at New York Comic Con, and they were just like, we're trying to do some different stuff. We're trying to do things that aren't just like, standard comic book stuff. Like, do you have anything that feels different? And I was like, I had just come up with that pitch like earlier that month, and I was like, yeah, I have this thing, I guess.
Hmm.
And they were like, yeah, this is exactly the kind of thing that we want to do.
Yeah.
So it was they were on board from the very beginning. And Jan Jones, who used to be at DC, who's unfortunately no longer at Legendary, but she sort of shepherded that project through and really believed in it. And that made it like a great experience because I always felt like Legendary was really behind what we were trying to do.
Yeah. It was interesting is that you're now the third author who's told me that Legendary talked to them at New York Comic Con, which is just interesting. They could literally like tell myself, I need to get to New York Comic Con.
I guess they
At
were very
some point,
busy. Yeah.
right? So I mean, I'm not an established writer, but it just seems like an interesting way of kind of getting here, like you know, having those conversations, especially with a publisher being open to to your ideas? I mean, was that just from an emotional standpoint, was that something that you were excited about when they talked to you, or is this like, oh, I, or like did you feel at that moment when you were talking
It
when?
was it was huge because I didn't know if anyone would even want this story. I didn't know if anyone would be, because I have this, this personal, thing that I want to do, which is tell this, kind of weird story with a trans protagonist, and it's not about her being trans, and it's like, like that's not a story that is like people were looking for,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
But when I described it to them, they were like, yeah, that actually sounds like really cool. Let's do this. That was a great feeling. It was really validating because it was just a story that I wanted to tell. And it wasn't a story that like where I had stopped to think like what would be marketable,
Right.
you know? It was just like I had this thing that was really pressing down on me and like a story that really wanted to be told. And so I just kind of took a chance and said, what about this? Um, and it paid off.
And along those same lines, like what for readers when they pick up um the first issue, kind of what do you want them to well, I guess it's kind of a broad question, but like is there something you're hoping that a reader gets when they pick up that first issue, something you hope that they connect with in the story?
Well, it's a graphic novel, so I hope they connect with the whole thing.
Right. Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah. But I mean, the thing that always I think every writer hopes for is that you connect with the protagonist like early,
Mhm.
and that you see this is a person who feels real and as someone whose eyes I feel comfortable looking through, or
Right.
at least feel interested in looking through. Even if the person themselves, the protagonists aren't always likable, they don't always have to be. But is this someone who I want to navigate through the story with?
Right.
And do we click? And does this story seem like something that, you know, for this story, mainly, I just want people to be turning pages, just
Mhm.
be like, I started reading and I couldn't stop and I got to the end and I had a lot of feelings about it. That's kind of what I want is that same sort of like rush of excitement, like when you find a book and you're like, oh, this is good. I don't want to put it down. That's what I'm looking for.
But then along those lines, like if you have that, you get that kind of you get that kind of reaction. Is this something because it's a graphic novel? Is this something that you would like to turn into like a series or a series of graphic
Uh,
novels? So you have like specific arcs in
Absolutely.
mind?
Yeah, I have other, murders, other mysteries to talk about. And it just, you have to wait and see how it performs before you can do more. So hopefully, the book will sell well and they'll be like, let's make a ton of these. And I would be perfectly happy to do that.
Right. Well, and again, along those lines, while you're or in that process, are you just working on the science of ghosts as far as like the next story you'd like to tell, or is there something else that you're working on, like another story that you're hoping to put out there as well?
Well, it's funny. I wrote a pitch for the next book in the series a couple years ago. And I sent it to Legendary just saying like, hey, here's some, if you ever wanted to do a sequel, here's an idea. And I reread it recently and I was like, oh, this is terrible. So I'm glad they didn't want to go forward with it because I don't like it anymore. But so I would want to revisit that. I have, it's funny because this book I wrote several years ago. And I'm glad that I still feel really emotionally attached to it. So in
Mhm.
other cases, if I'd written a book, 4 years earlier and it was just coming out, I'd be like, honestly, I barely remember writing it. Um,
Mhm.
I don't have a great memory when it comes to my own work. But this one is very, very clear in my mind. And I am working on other things. I'm working on a book with Lev Grossman called The Heavens that I'm super excited about. And I just got done writing a book with my good old buddy Dave Justice for Mad Cave,
Oh, okay.
which has not been announced yet, so I can't say anything more about it. But yeah, I'm a busy bee right now. It's very nice.
Yeah, it must feel good to, be busy and have and be able to let those creative things come out. But
Yeah, it's nice.
yeah. Well, one thing I also like to ask, especially comic book writers or writers of graphic novels in that medium, and you can answer it not. It's just like if there was an established character you've you've never written for, um, have you ever kind of like sat back and had an idea of, oh, you know what, I have this great idea for this character, and I don't want to hear the idea because I'm hoping to read it. But if you could kind of tell me uh, who the character is and kind of why you think that you could tell a great story for this character.
Yeah, it's funny because I would always say Superman because I love Superman just as a character,
Hmm.
as someone that I find really appealing, and I have really strong opinions about the character and
Hmm.
how he should be written and what he means to people and all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
But like if you gave me the keys to DC Comics,
Hmm.
um it's actually a Batman story that I would write, which
Really?
is funny because I don't even like Batman that much. I think he's like kind of played out as a character, and
Hmm.
I kind of don't agree with the character in a lot of ways. But like, I had a great idea for a Batman story, and
Hmm.
I really want to tell it someday.
Right.
So, who knows? We'll see if
Yeah,
I ever
yeah.
get a, yeah,
Well,
if I ever get a chance.
I think it's interesting if you're not necessarily like a huge fan of a character, but you have an idea for a character, it brings a different perspective to that character. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
I kind of like seeing outside opinions on characters because then
mhm.
it kind of informs mine. Either I completely agree that, this is a direction the character should take, or I'm like, this is such a complete contrast. It makes me appreciate the things I like more. So
Right, 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 right.
that's definitely an interesting take. I like the fact that like you went with the character you really want to write for, but you have like like it intrigues me that you have an idea for a character you're not necessarily a huge fan of.
Yeah, I know it's weird, right?
Yeah, because now I'm like, well, what would she do?
What would that be like? Yeah,
Right,
exactly.
exactly. Exactly. In fact, I'd probably be more curious than the
Mhm.
story is like, oh, I love Superman. Here's a Superman story. I say, okay, but I don't not a huge fan of Batman. Here's the story I want to tell for
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah,
yeah. Maybe that's the way to do it?
it might be.
Yeah.
Um, uh, but Lilah Sturges, if you wanted people to follow you online, where could they find you?
Right now, I'm not too online.
Mhm.
You can go to lilasturgis.com and find me at my website. You can go to on the social media app Blue Sky. I'm on there at lilasturgis.com. I'm not on Twitter anymore.
Yeah,
Um, I don't really do much on Instagram or anything. So kind of a weird time for social media where,
yeah.
it's like, do I even want to do this?
No, I'm with you because I absolutely respect anyone who's just like, you know what, I'm just not in the place where I need to be there right now.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah,
I need to be like physically social, not not parasocial
yeah.
at this point. Well,
Yeah,
the
I'm
science
around. People can find me.
okay.
Hmm.
The Science of Ghosts comes out June 18th,
Hmm.
2024 from Legendary Comics. I am definitely looking forward to it. I'm gonna pick it up and read it, and it'll be reviewed on the site. But Lilah Sturgis, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate
My pleasure.
it. Once again, I want to thank Lilah Sturgis for being on the Fancast. The Science of Ghosts is currently available as of this episode, and I recommend you check it out. You can find news, reviews, and more on superpoweredfancast.com. You can also follow me on X at superpoweredfan and Instagram at superpoweredfancast. You can also join my Facebook group at facebook.com/superpoweredfancast or email me at superpoweredfancast@gmail.com. Once again, this is Darren for Superpowered Fancast, signing off. Thank you for watching.